Josh Carlson is the author of Spacepower Ascendant. We'll be talking about that a lot. A book independently published through Kindle. It was the culmination of nearly 12 months of dedicated research and evaluation of both U.S. and China's views. He serves in both the Army and Air Force in different capacities. He is currently working on a new book with an as yet unpublished author that is targeted for next year. The new book will examine similarities in all dimensions, what missions need to be emphasized in various phases of space development, and examine the space domain to provide recommendations on U.S. Space Force development. Thank you, Josh. Please take it away. Looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. So just to start all of my comments, obviously I want to say I'm speaking in a personal capacity. Nothing I say is endorsed by any governmental agency or the DoD. So starting off, I think bouncing off of Michael Mealing's great comments about the importance of space development and the history that we've had up to this point and the incredible position that we're in at the moment. And I think that I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to the Moon Society, especially since the moon is such an important element in space, especially as it regards the Mars and other celestial bodies. There's never been an expansion in space. Obviously, we've never had permanent presence outside of the International Space Station is, I believe, the highest altitude system we've ever had. And so it's difficult to draw historical or it's difficult to draw on a history that doesn't exist yet in space. But by reasoning, by analogy, I believe we can arrive at the framework and the process with which to develop space at a strategic and national level. And so to do that, that's the basis of the book I wrote, Spacepower Ascendant, which puts forward space development theory in particular, which suggests that there is 4 phases that nations and the peoples inside those nations and organizations, etc., will go through as it develops a new domain. And the first 3 are linear. The 4th is conditional on outside interference. The first is exploration, which as space professionals, as space enthusiasts, that's very familiar to those who are steeped in the history of space. That's a large amount of what we've done, virtually all. And exploration has a variety of facets. It has a variety of purposes. During exploration, you're seeing what's in the domain. How do you move in the domain? What the key locations are, potential resources. How do you move most efficiently in the domain? And this maps across all expansions. Or all explorations, rather. Going back into the age of sail, you had Captain Cook's voyage across the Pacific would be an example of exploration, for instance. Columbus's voyage to the New World, another version of exploration. The Chinese treasure fleets about the same time going to Africa, also exploration. They are a chance to increase the knowledge of that society and lay some initial soft power claims based on the naming and the mapping of those locations. And it gives the society a greater fidelity of what's there, scientifically, physically, etc. That is, as I've already said, that's the majority of what's gone on in space. And in Earth's orbits, we've entered the second phase, which is expansion, which is the permanent extension of national architecture to both provide safety and speed and minimize risk of travel in the domain. So once again, so Captain Cook's voyage across the Pacific, he mapped. Once they did that, they set up bases within about 20 years. And the maps that they brought back enabled vessels to navigate much more effectively. The bases enabled them to refuel. It increased the capacity to move in the domain. In Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic, you set up cities. You began setting up military outposts, resupply posts, and the ships going across the entire Atlantic didn't have to go all the way to the other side, hope to get supplies. Christopher Columbus convinced the natives to give him supplies because he knew there was going to be a lunar eclipse, and he suggested to them that he controlled the lunar eclipse, and they gave him supplies. But that's obviously not a very recommended method of securing supplies. And so you set up permanent bases, and then the ships could travel across the Atlantic, have a known resupply, refueling point, and then journey back across. It decreased the risk. And likewise, in orbit, you've had permanent communication satellites, GPS, all sorts of things that benefit particularly life here on Earth. We have never had the outside of Earth's orbits, that expansion phase, take place. And I think we are on the cusp of that. The Chinese and Russians just this, I believe 2 months ago, signed a lunar development, a lunar base treaty. And just last week or week before, China announced that they would begin construction of this base by 2026, which would be finding of the site, groundbreaking, et cetera. They, based on the timelines I've seen, 2036 is probably when that will be operational, unless they've managed to accelerate it due to the fact they've now pooled their resources with Russia, potentially. And likewise, the United States has the Artemis Accords and the Gateway project that was meant to put orbiting space station around the moon. And that would also be a permanent extension. Once again, for the first time, humans will be able to exist for extended periods outside of Earth's gravity well entirely. In addition to those three nations, China, Russia, and the United States, Japan, as already mentioned, UAE, Brazil, the EU, India, have all expressed some form of interest in moon resources, moon settlement. The moon is becoming, in a lot of respects, at least in my impression, the gold rush of the space domain, the new area that everyone is very interested in. Based on the context strategically, that makes a lot of sense to me, because the moon, in a lot of ways, is an excellent refueling point, and an initial capacity check coming off of Earth. In a lot of ways, from Europe to America, it would look a lot like the Canary Islands. It's an excellent place to have ships refuel, or be able to ideally mine propellant, getting slightly ahead of myself, mine propellant, send it back to orbit, and you can keep satellites on orbit, stations on orbit for an extended period of time, due to the fact that they can continually refuel at a fraction of the cost it would take to get that same propellant off of Earth. And all of that is expansion, the second phase. And it's still a net drain on resources. And in a lot of ways, the national architecture has to invest upfront for that. Once you get to the next phase, however, which is where and we're kind of doing, SpaceX is already, I think, straining to get to this point of exploitation, which is the use now of these resources and these locations to generate a net positive. So in other words, the various nations or coalitions or independent entities had to invest whatever, $2 million annually to be able to maintain a moon base, for instance. And now they are generating $2.1 million in revenue through whatever means of this moon base. They have entered the phase of exploitation, in that it is now a net positive to maintain their presence in that location. And more than likely, they will continue to expand as it continues to be profitable. The trading posts that the British set up, obviously the cities in the Americas and in Mexico that were set up, Cuba, that eventually became net positives economically. And it would be the moon base, once it is able to use any of the number of resources, or just simply the location of it on the moon, to be able to generate a net positive. It has entered the phase of exploitation. And at that point, you are already in a net positive, and now more than likely the companies will continue to expand because they continue to make profit. And of course, the government should incentivize, both through the protection of it physically, as well as establishing legal frameworks to maximize this this exploitation of it, because it bolsters, from a national perspective, it bolsters national capability, what's termed soft power in international relation theory. And in the final phase, which, as I mentioned, and nations always, in my opinion, want to stay in exploitation. Every nation wants to always be making net economic positives from regions they control, especially those they've expanded to. Then there is the national, the conditional phase of exclusion, which is if there is a national, international, commercial competitor that is attempting to infringe on an area that is already controlled, or the nation sees a potential area they wish to control that is in the offing, they may enter an exclusion phase, which is once again an exertion phase of attempting to either control or deny control to a usually national actor. So the French and Indian War, or that were fought in the Americas right before the Revolution War, right around 1750s, between the English that were expanding west off of the 13 colonies on the coast, and the French and their Indian allies that were already in the hinterlands. And the English were continuing to expand. The French didn't want them to expand due to the some of the lucrative trapping and other economic things they already had in place. They fought an indirect war, a guerrilla war, in an effort to stop the British. The British ended up winning, and they continued to expand further into the continent. This would be an example of exclusion. A much more modern example would be Iraq, for instance, taking Kuwait and attempting, and they saw an offering, they took it, they attempted to then retain that from the US-led coalition. They were not able to, they were not successful in that exclusion. Putting all of these together, thank you, Mike. Putting all of these together, a fairly obvious progression shows between those. And as Mike mentioned, I've spoken actually with Nami extensively about the Chinese space program, which I think is very concerning in my opinion. And in particular, because the United States, there have been pockets of it, but in my impression, and I'm sure there'll be some interesting discussions later about the U.S. space program and how it's been related to possible expansions, economic expansions. There was O'Neill wrote a book about putting O'Neill cylinders, which are huge constructions able to turn to create their own false gravity, as far back as the 1970s. And he claimed at that point that industrially, engineering wise, we were able to do it, but obviously it hasn't happened yet. Why not? Based on my analysis from developing space development theory, the fact is there's been no economic driver for it, and there's been no international driver for it. And so the combination of those two, if there was, for instance, pure gold on the moon in vast quantities, more than likely, if the economic case made sense, there would already be nations mining that on the moon. There's not. Or an international competition. Obviously, the Cold War fueled the first moon race, but that was purely for national bragging rights, for lack of a better term, and exploration. It was I would argue it was couched in exploration. It was really just to be able to show that we could do it before the Soviets could. It was a test of civilizational capability, but that was not economic, and that was not true expansion. And there have been those who had the vision for this. One of the first Air Force projects was Project Horizon, which contemplated a potential Air Force base on the moon back as far as, if I remember correctly, like the 1950s, obviously before the Lunar Treaty, or the Outer Space Treaty, and all of the language there that prevented military installation. So it was completely possible at the time. But there's been visions of this, but no mass movement. And I think it's a pity Mike had to drop, but I was going to say that the two things that, in my opinion, that are changing is the economic case is starting to become on the border, if not already viable on the moon, based on several studies I've seen, particularly looking at lunar ice, being able to get lunar ice once you have the infrastructure on the moon, you have lunar ice mined, converted into propellant, send that back to Earth's orbit. You can actually fuel satellites, according to the study I read. You can fuel satellites in Earth's orbit more cheaply than you can bringing it from Earth's surface, due to the difference in the gravity well and the amount of thrust required, therefore propellant, therefore financial requirements to get it off of Earth. And so in the very short term, looking at developing this, like I said, there's tons of satellites in Earth orbit, and to have the capability to refuel those, and especially once the satellites are created with the capacity from the beginning to be able to refuel them. This is potentially a significant market, and one that would be fairly expansive, with some estimates I've seen as high as 40,000 satellites in Earth's orbit by the end of this decade. And that's not even counting the cost of human settlement on the moon. There's going to be, in my opinion, several moon bases on the moon by 2040, assuming that the nations who have already pledged they are going to do it don't default. If those are there, and even if there's incredibly efficient means of recycling water, etc., to have the capacity to add to that water or use propellant to get the rockets that are bringing the astronauts, taikonauts, whichever happen to be there at that point, to the moon and back to Earth, that also could be a significant market. And more importantly, even if the market's significantly smaller, the price differential, it is obviously far cheaper to mine ice on the moon once the infrastructure is there and convert it into propellant than it is even to bring it back to Earth's orbit. And so these are some examples. One other that that I have assessed as a potential one is also rare earth elements, and the fact that there is, in my estimation, a national competition at the moment that rare earth elements have been weaponized in the sense of supply or denying that supply. One example is Japan captured a Chinese trawler that they alleged was in Chinese waters, or in Japanese waters rather, and of course China alleged they were not. But the Japanese took them into custody, and the Chinese, I believe this was like 2015, 2016, cut off supply of the rare earth elements. China controls between 70 and 97% of the rare earth element distribution on Earth, which means that if they desire leverage potentially in the area of rare earth elements, which of course are intrinsic for the key high-tech items like computers, electric cars, solar panels, if they deny these to a nation and their industrial capacity, it obviously will hurt China, although to whatever extent is unclear. Of course, it will grind that nation's industry to a halt, which would be a significant amount of economic leverage to consider. One potential way to diversify this, they're digging other mines, they're delving deeper in current mines here on Earth, but also being able to mine this on the moon and potentially even generate an industrial capacity on the moon. There's also been some mention of helium-3. I would be very interested to see any other studies than the ones I've read, but most of the assessment I've seen is that there's not enough of it to generate a meaningful electric capacity here on Earth, and so it wouldn't be economically viable. In my book, I do point out, however, that Uranus, it has vast quantities of helium-3, and it's actually easily gatherable with our current technology. The major issue there is, once again, that initial price hurdle to get over the cost of getting there, but having power plants here that would actually be able to be configured to use it. But I'll leave that for another time. I think, Mike, I had until the top of the hour, and I'm going to try to make sure I can stay on time for our other guests. I'm sure they also have incredibly insightful things to say. I do want to finish with the thought that I do believe strongly, and I would recommend you check out the book. I think it argues its point very well. Shameless plug there. But within approximately 15 years, and I would assess perhaps sooner, there are going to be major changes to the space domain. Not necessarily, I expect them to be economic, technological, etc. But strategically and internationally, by the end of the 2030s, so by 2040, the United States is expected to have a moon base. China and Russia will have a moon base. More than likely, they'll be basing other nations on those. As I said, Japan, UAE, Brazil, EU, India, all of that. All of those nations are most likely going to have some form of presence, probably, and probably others by that point, on the moon or in cislunar space. The Chinese have already declared they will have a nuclear space vessels capable of maneuvering in cislunar space. There was a recent article by Christopher Stone arguing that the United States also needs to embrace atomic-powered spacecraft to be able to also maneuver in space. And these are, obviously, there's military applications, but more importantly, there's also economic and other bleed over commercial applications to all of these technologies. Once you can move fairly freely and at fairly low cost in cislunar, that changes a lot of the economic calculations. Once you have infrastructure on the moon, that changes economic calculations. And I don't think it's going to be a linear progression based on space development theory, based on previous developments. It can be fairly meteoric, fairly quick gain, so to speak, on that, which means, final thought on space development theory is that space development theory recognizes that generally in indirect warfare is the most perfect form of warfare, summed up by Sun Tzu's maxim. To defeat the enemy strategy is true. Not to succeed in 1,000 battles, but to defeat the enemy without fighting. To be able to position ourselves first, obviously as an American, I care about America, but I care also that the rest of the world, and especially our allies, are welcomed into this space economy that will form over the next 15 years. And being able to be positioned first allows us to assist in helping that system develop in both a way that is equitable and equal and beneficial to the world as a whole.
Sure. Thank you, Josh. That was really interesting. You covered a lot of stuff quickly. I'm gonna make a not very shameless plug. I'm gonna echo Colonel Reed's comment here. He's referencing your book. Quote, "It presents a logical, reasonable progression of concepts that takes into consideration of available historic analogs." Very thought-provoking. So I don't know, Josh, if you know Colonel Reed, but I'm happy to connect the two of y'all on LinkedIn if you like.
I would appreciate it. I'll be honest, I might know him. I'm horrible with names, but I'm great with faces. So okay. I would be more than happy to connect.
Right on. All right. We're going to move on. Thank you very much, Josh. Really appreciate it. It is an interesting idea, and it does show how once you get through some of the phases of space development and development terrestrially here on the ground, that stuff moves pretty fast. And I believe that we're in this kind of inflection curve heading to the moon pretty darn fast.